Reiser, the White House is set to issue new executive orders, stepping up President Trump's immigration agenda. And we take a look at what voters think of the administration as the president nears his 100th day in office. Hello and thank you for joining us. On the eve of his 100th day in office, President Trump is putting a heavy focus on immigration. The president is signing two executive orders Monday, one focused on the role of U.S. law enforcement and another targeting so-called sanctuary cities. The move comes as the president prepares to mark the 100th day of his second administration Tuesday. The White House says he will host a rally in Macomb County, Michigan, outside of Detroit. Earlier Monday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt celebrated the administration's actions on immigration and the border.
One of President Trump's central campaign promises was to secure the border and end this invasion. In just under 100 days, 99 now to be exact, the president has overwhelmingly delivered on that promise.
CBS News polling shows Americans are split down the middle when it comes to the administration's overhaul, with 49% approving and 51% disapproving of the president's handling of immigration. CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins us now. Willie, what do these executive orders do? And more broadly, is the administration going to continue moving forward with this hardline immigration stance?
Hey there, Lindsay. Good to be with you on this Monday evening. Well, one of them in particular will focus on sanctuary cities, basically naming names in terms of those cities and governments, local governments across the country who are not cooperating with the administration in terms of their immigration crackdown. We know that there have been a couple of court cases, not just recently, but previously, cities like San Francisco leading the charge and fighting and pushing back against the Trump administration in that fight in court. But we, of course, know that this president and this White House is not going to slow down in terms of its push to carry out the president's want to deport undocumented migrants. The White House says some 139,000 undocumented migrants have been deported since President Trump took office. And you can see behind me these yard signs. The White House says are pictures of alleged criminals and undocumented migrants. The White House has sought to target and talk about those migrants, and not only in the media, but in their messaging on their social media accounts, as saying how these individuals are dangerous and need to be removed from American society, need to be removed from American streets. So that's part of the push to point out these locations across the country that are essentially not cooperating with the federal government in terms of their immigration push, but also to highlight what the White House calls the criminal element of these alleged criminals, I should say, of these undocumented migrants who are spread out across the country that the administration wants to focus on and apprehend and ultimately deport. Lindsay.
The Treasury Secretary says there could be some trade news on the horizon. What do you know?
Yeah, that's right. We saw Secretary Bessent speak before reporters earlier today. We, of course, know that the White House has 90 days. They put a 90-day limit essentially on these negotiations with hundreds of different nations. But Asian nations in particular have really been at the forefront of making those deals or looking to make those deals with the administration. We know that there have been conversations with Vietnam, South Korea, the Japanese as well. We know, according to the Treasury Secretary, that President Trump will get the final sign-off on all of these deals. And one of the things I should also mention is South Korea. Those technical conversations could perhaps take place this week. We don't yet know what country will be announced, what deal will be announced, I should say. But the White House is moving forward and pushing forward with those deals, looking to, I guess, ease the brunt, so to speak, in terms of that public polling that we've seen with that CBS News polling, I should point out, that says the president is too focused on tariffs and not focused enough on lowering prices and other priorities that Americans think he should focus on.
The Trump administration has issued a new memo for federal agencies to crack down on work from home. What's happening there?
Yeah, that's right. This was a memo sent out to federal agencies asking them to comply with an order by May 4th. Starting on May 4th, they have to start compiling individuals when they come in. Essentially, when you scan your badge, they'll start compiling that information basically day by day, week by week. And this is part of the Trump administration enforcing what they see as that return to work policy, making sure that the American people are getting their money's worth with these government employees coming into the office. The days of COVID-era policies are essentially gone, according to this White House. So we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. The memo doesn't necessarily mention that workers will necessarily be fired, but for not showing up. But this is one of the ways that the Trump administration can track who is actually showing up to work, who is employed, and how often they come into work, Lindsey.
Willie James Inman, thank you. The Trump administration is defending how it has handled a case involving a migrant mother and her 2-year-old daughter, who is a legal U.S. citizen. Officials deported the mother to Honduras. They claim the woman decided to bring her toddler as well as her 11-year-old Honduran-born daughter with her. On Monday, Borders' our Tom Holman had this to say about the situation.
What we did is remove children with their mothers who requested the children depart with them. This was a parental decision, parenting 101. The mothers made that choice. And I tell you what, if we didn't do it, the story today would be Trump administration separating families again.
CBS News Justice Department reporter Jake Rosen joins us now. Jake, what do we know and what comes next?
Well, Lindsey, this is one case of which there's a couple that happened over the weekend and from Friday, in which the Trump administration moved so fast that it did not, according to lawyers for this family, give the opportunity for the mother to call the father, who is here in America, and potentially find a way to get this child, who is a U.S. citizen, back to not leave America and to be in the custody of either family members who are here or other people who are trying to be representatives for that family. Briefly, the Trump administration and the Department of Homeland Security said that they did give an opportunity for this to happen. And really, I think what you have to remember here is that the Trump administration is trying to do these deportations, and yes, by removing the mother, they're doing what they have set out to do, right? But when there are U.S. citizens involved and the Trump administration is trying to take away birthright citizenship and has appealed numerous court decisions, you have to remember that it's very difficult for this child to potentially even return to the country, even if it is allowed and a judge does somehow order this child to be returned. Well, the child can't travel alone. There's a number of cases, that are going on right now. And the mothers are banned from the United States because they were ordered to be deported for at least a temporary amount of time.
The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement Friday saying 2 other children who are also U.S. citizens were removed from the U.S. along with their mother, who was deported. What do we know about this?
Well, that's right, Lindsey. One of these children has a metastatic form of cancer, and because this family went to an ICE check-in as people who are here illegally, they had to meet with immigration officials and check in regularly. If you miss those appointments, you're able to be deported. And in this case, the family went to go to this ICE meeting, and from there, the family was detained and they were deported. This 4-year-old and the 7-year-old are U.S. citizens. So again, the same kind of situation where people go in, and this child was, at least the one with cancer, did not have its medication on them. And this was a series of flights, the same as the previous case, in which the family was deported Friday. Attorneys for both of these families say that despite what the Trump administration says, that there was some kind of opportunity for the children to either have their due process heard or that there really was not, Lindsey, and that in these cases specifically, they just removed the mother. The mothers said they claim that the mother wrote a letter saying that she wanted to bring the children with her. However, the attorneys dispute that, again, in both of these cases.
All right, Jake Rosen, thank you. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine to begin next month. Putin says the military will pause all fighting from May 8th to the 10th to mark Victory Day and the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, a major Russian holiday. The move comes after President Trump sat down with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky while they were in Vatican City to attend the funeral of Pope Francis. In an interview Sunday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the administration needs to see progress toward a peace deal.
I think this is going to be a very critical week. This week is going to be a really important week in which we have to make a determination about whether this is an endeavor that we want to continue to be involved in, or if it's time to sort of focus on some other issues that are equally, if not more important in some cases.
CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata joins us now. How significant was it that the Secretary of State said equal, if not more important? And also, what can you tell us about this ceasefire? Has Russia honored its own ceasefires in the past?
Yeah, well, Lindsey, first of all, I mean, let's be honest. We've seen ceasefires break down in a matter of hours, let alone days, right? And so the Russians have already threatened to fight back with full force if the Ukrainians don't go along with the ceasefire. So that's going to really have to be a wait and see what the Kremlin stays true to their word. As for the significance, that might actually be more meaningful, you know, the why now rather than the how. Putin has said the ceasefire is a humanitarian gesture. But it may also be an attempt to look like a gesture of goodwill to the Trump administration, especially in light of what the Secretary of State has said. Everybody knows that the White House is running out of patience and time. It shows that Russia may be willing to compromise. And of course, it shows that Russia has the power to press pause on fighting. Russia and Putin personally have become the target of Trump criticism in the past week or so. So this might be about positioning. The Ukrainians are already dubious. They believe that it's meant to show that they're the warmongers and not the Russians. A Ukrainian official said, look, why not just have a ceasefire now, right? Why just have a ceasefire so Putin can have a victory parade? And by the way, victory parade used to be celebrated in Ukraine too until the Russians invaded. So it kind of puts Zelensky in the corner in terms of going along with this sort of ceasefire, cynically saying, no, we want a ceasefire that's going to be lasting, and we want it now.
North Korea is for the first time acknowledging it sent troops to help Russia. What can you tell us about this alliance? What's in it for North Korea, and what impact have North Korean troops had on the war?
Yeah, I got to tell you, it took me by surprise this morning when I saw that announcement made. It's the first official acknowledgement, because we reported this months ago. You and I discussed it, citing first South Korean officials, then confirming it with our military sources here, that the North Koreans were there. So it was hardly a secret, but this is the first official acknowledgement from Russia and North Korea. Putin even thanking North Korea and fighting shoulder to shoulder with Russian fighters, especially in the Kursk region. But it does signal a sort of next level tie between the two countries. In terms of impact, it's hard to see, and I've spoken to officials here, how 12,000 North Korean troops, untrained North Korean troops, had much of an impact when hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened Russian forces were taking part in the war. But specifically when it comes to Kursk itself, even though they took tremendous losses, the Ukrainians had to give up that territory. So the North Koreans may have suffered between 3,000 and 4,000 casualties themselves. But even the Ukrainians have said that the North Koreans gained crucial battleground experience in that fight. So it may have been critical to Kursk, and I guess because the Ukrainians have been all but forced out. But I guess it's down to see whether or not that this relationship, this alliance, which had been made official before North Korean soldiers were deployed to Russia, how that is going to develop over the weeks and months ahead.
Charlie Daggett, thanks so much. As Pope Francis was laid to rest this weekend, focus now turns to selecting his successor. New details on what exactly will happen when cardinals gather to pick the next leader of the Catholic Church next week. Plus, Canadians head to the polls to choose their next prime minister. What's at stake and how President Trump's tariffs and talks of making it a U.S. state are playing a role. You're watching The Daily Report. Canadians are casting their votes to elect the country's next prime minister. The snap election comes just 6 weeks after Liberal Party leader Mark Carney was sworn in to replace his colleague Justin Trudeau after he stepped down. Canadians had become increasingly frustrated with Trudeau and the party in recent years over the handling of the economy, unemployment, and immigration. Carney is vying for a full 4-year term against Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre. A weekend poll from Canada-based firm Forum Research shows 60-year-old Carney is likely to stay in power. Earlier this year, Canadians seemed poised to elect a Conservative leader, but that appears to have changed with the return of President Trump and his tariffs on Canada. For more, let's bring in Martina Stevis-Gridneff. She's the Canada Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Martina, thank you for being here. Last month, let's just catch everybody up to speed because the tariff numbers can be a bit dizzying. President Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian exports that are not part of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement went into effect, in addition to a 10% tariff on energy products. Canada then imposed a 25% tariff on some American products like steel, aluminum, auto imports. How has this affected the election? Is it the issue?
It is the top issue, and not just the tariffs. And I really sympathize with the confusion there. There's been a lot of back and forth on the tariffs. But what's also been on people's minds a lot here is the broader rhetoric by President Trump. We heard from him even this morning as people were going to vote. He's sort of refrain of making Canada the 51st state. His sort of insinuations that the border isn't real, it's old, it's artificial. People consider that very menacing. They consider it threatening. And so not only do Canadian voters go to vote thinking that their economy is under threat by their closest ally and trading partner, but also that their sovereignty is under threat. That is weighing on people's minds.
So on Monday, you had mentioned this talk of the 51st state. President Trump suggested on social media Canadians should vote for him in this election, repeated his calls for Canada to become the 51st state. How have Carney and Poilievre been responding to this?
Mark Carney has built his campaign around these claims and has presented himself as a sort of anti-Trump. He's very serious. He's a professional economist. And he says he's the man to fight against these claims and to represent Canada, make Canada strong so it can stand up to President Trump and what he's been talking about. Pierre Poilievre has found this an awkward situation. While he has also said that he will resist these claims, that he will fight for Canada, that he will impose countermeasures in the U.S. in terms of tariffs, the awkwardness comes from the fact that he often does sound a bit like President Trump, and Canadians are very sensitive to this. Pierre Poilievre has spoken about, stopping radical woke ideology, cutting back the state, defunding the national broadcaster here in Canada, the CBC. And so, together with his quite harsh at times tone, a lot of centrist voters who were really considering voting for the Conservative Party have been turned off by this sort of perceived similarity.
What are the other issues that Canadians are concerned about and might be voting for?
I mean, I think top of mind is the question of affordability. We've seen it in other countries. Here in Canada, the biggest issue, I think, is the housing situation. Housing is unaffordable both to rent and to buy, particularly for those first-time buyers. Folks are getting pushed out beyond the suburbs because of these really high prices, and an overall sense that the economy is sort of stagnant. It's not in a recession, but it's not really meeting its full potential. Unemployment has been persistently high. And so there's an overall fatigue after these 10 years of the Liberal government under former Prime Minister Trudeau. I think the economy is going to be really central to whoever, frankly, comes next, be it Mr. Carney or Mr. Poilievre. And each man is saying they've got the solution both to the U.S. and Trump issue and to the economic troubles at home.
And you and your colleagues have reported that since 2023, all news has been blocked in Canada on Facebook and Instagram because of a law that required Meta to pay Canadian news publishers a tax for publishing content. What kind of impact has this had on Canada specifically during election season?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that reporting. I mean, it's very hard to quantify that impact. For example, it's hard to know how many people have been swayed one way or another in terms of how to vote because of this. But the reality is that on Facebook and on Instagram in Canada, you can find a lot of hyper-partisan content. You can find a lot of misleading and misinformation content. You can find a lot of fake ads and fake news. You can't find actual news. And this is sort of unbalanced diet that's creating a very bizarre and warped reality on those platforms. There's obviously a lot of misinformation and a lot of partisan content on all social media platforms and out in society too. But the news is also present, and there is somewhere to go to look for it. A lot of people still think they're getting their news on Facebook and Instagram and are unaware of this ban here in Canada.
I'm a daily listener of the New York Times Daily Podcast. Was it you who said that you thought being the Canada bureau chief would give you work-life balance?
I mean, I did. To be clear, in the New York Times sense, that means I would only be working, 10-hour days rather than 16-hour days. I've got a bit of flack for that. I wasn't coming here to rest.
No, I know. It was so funny because the timing, of course, this is just all in the news every single day. That was a very memorable line. I'm not giving you flack, but Bettina, thank you so much for gracing our show.
Thanks, Lindsay. I appreciate it.
The conclave to elect the next pope will begin next Wednesday. About 135 cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote for Pope Francis' successor. Over the weekend, thousands of mourners and dozens of world leaders, including President Trump and former President Biden, paid tribute to the late pontiff at St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay has the latest from Rome. Chris?
Well, now that we know exactly when the conclave is going to begin, preparations are underway for the cardinals in Rome or coming to Rome to elect the next pope. Now, a lot has been made of the fact that Francis elected or named the majority of the cardinals who are going to be participating in this conclave. And so you might think, well, he'll probably be cut from the same cloth as Francis. He's going to be a champion of the poor, of the marginalized, of the voiceless. Many say he'll be progressive for all these reasons, but that's not necessarily the case. One of the reasons is because so many of these cardinals that Pope Francis named come from the periphery. They come from countries that we're not necessarily familiar with. They weren't necessarily having cardinals in the past. So we're talking about places like East Timor, Mongolia, places that where people don't necessarily even have the experience that other cardinals have had to form relationships and form voting blocs. Many of them don't even necessarily speak Italian, which is the lingua franca here, the universal language. So it's a big wild card. We can't clearly predict who the front runners are, what direction the church is going to take. We won't really find out until that white smoke goes up behind me over the Sistine Chapel. Back to you.
Chris Livesay, thank you. A massive power outage hits parts of Spain and Portugal Monday. The outage caused internet and phone networks to go down, halted trains, shut down traffic lights, and caused major delays at airports. Spain's prime minister says half of the country's power has been restored. It's still unclear what caused the outage. CBS News national correspondent Jerika Duncan just returned from a trip from Portugal and joins us now. So, Jerika, your sister is still there. How has the outage affected her? Are you able to reach her?
Yeah, so just moments ago, I actually got a call from her saying the power has been restored. So this is something she was dealing with for about 12 hours. Initially, I saw the headline and I actually screenshot it and I sent it to her in the WhatsApp. And I'm like, are you okay? And she's like, no, we have no power. So it was evident that we heard about the widespread power outage in Spain and in Portugal that my sister was in fact impacted. She just moved there with her family a couple of months ago. And I got a chance to speak to her earlier today, and I just asked her to describe the scene and what she was experiencing at that time. Take a listen.
I went to the grocery store and I got post-apocalyptic vibes. The lines were crazy. Everybody had like multiple gallons of water, perishable like food was just on the shelves because everything people had was like canned goods.
So first of all, we got to talk about how cute my nephews are, right? Okay, no, really, the focus is the fact that she and her family now have power. She said she actually noticed that something was off because they have an EV, an electric vehicle, and they tried to plug it up and it wasn't working. And then she said a neighbor told her that they didn't have power, and it was evident that it was about to get real. And in fact, they went and got a hotel because she had work that she needed to do, and they were ready to camp out overnight, but they got that power restored and all is well. But it is that moment where you start to think about what really matters and what you absolutely need. Canned foods and a lot of water.
And how much we rely on.
though?
Oh my gosh, I know, but what something you said made me think real world Portugal, when people stop being polite and start getting real.
Exactly.
Should we be part of the
world.
cast? All right, Jerika Duncan, thank you so
I think
much.
we've got a future on the real world. I really do.
Thanks. I'm glad your sister's well. Thank you so much. Positive and productive is how a senior U.S. official described weekend talks with Iran, how negotiations over Tehran's nuclear program are going, and where things currently stand. You're watching the Daily Report. Welcome back to the Daily Report. I'm Lindsey Reiser. Here are some additions to our top stories. Virginia Congressman Jerry Connolly has announced he's stepping down as the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee and will not seek re-election next year. Connolly cited the return of his esophageal cancer, which he first announced last year. The 75-year-old has served in Congress since 2009. Another judge is taking over the docket of Wisconsin Judge Hannah Dugan starting Monday after the FBI arrested her Friday for allegedly interfering with a federal immigration arrest at her courthouse. Dugan was later released. Her next court appearance is scheduled for May 15th. Florida police released new video Monday afternoon showing the moment a boat crashed into a ferry Sunday night. One person was killed. 10 others on board the ferry were hurt in what the Clearwater Fire Department is calling a mass casualty event. The captain of the recreational boat initially fled the scene. Police say they later took a breathalyzer test which showed no alcohol in their system. As President Trump wraps up his first 100 days in office of his second administration, new CBS News polling shows less than half of Americans approve of how he's doing. Our latest numbers show his approval rating sitting at 45%. That's an 8% drop from early February, just a few weeks into his term when his approval was at 53%. Since then, it has been a steady decline. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now. Anthony, good to see you here. Is he doing what he promised?
Well, that's exactly what we asked, folks. And what I'm going to show you here is 6 in 10 people think, in fact, that he is. Now, look, whether they like it or not, as you described, his ratings are a little bit down, right, from where he started. He started pretty high. But look at what it is among Trump voters. You get this almost 9 in 10 that say that he is. And he's got really strong approval from that political base, which helps, again, note that we're in a different, very partisan, very polarized political environment here. The difference in the movement on a lot of those ratings, right, is on this. Here's the handling of the economy. Now, that's down as well, as is handling inflation. But the reason for that is that it's coming from people who kind of gave him a chance on the economy. They're not necessarily Republican MAGA voters, but they thought that he, in his policies, would make them financially better off. Instead, they're saying that they're not, and they think the administration isn't focused enough on lowering prices. Prices, as folks who've been watching know, have long been the top concern of Americans, and that's what explains some of that movement.
The economy, one of the biggest issues, but also one of the biggest issues that the president is focused on is immigration and his crackdown on illegal immigration. How do people feel about that? And is there a distinction between whether people approve of a crackdown on illegal immigration and whether they approve of how it's being handled?
You know, I think that's the perfect question because you do see that break, right? Here is the approval of the program in general, right? The program for deportations. That stays at 56% approval. That's about where it's been. But if you follow that up when you ask about, as you said, things that may or may not happen in practice, look at this. You get 3/4 of folks who say it's not acceptable if, as part of that program, legal U.S. residents are mistakenly detained. And that explains some of the movement, too, on immigration more generally. So, again, there's the sort of broad idea and then what happens in practice.
How it's being applied. What about his use of executive orders, presidential powers?
Well, that really ties into all that, right? And that's part of the larger theme. Couple of things here. One is that on the matter of using executive orders, there's still a large number who say, let's say in theory, it's checks and balances, right? They want a president to work with Congress to pass laws.
That number surprises me. This is your bread and butter, so maybe it doesn't surprise you, but that seems very high.
You often get people who say in the abstract that there's a role for Congress. They don't necessarily always approve of Congress, but that back and forth is part of the process, right? There is. And that quarter say use executive orders. Now, that doesn't mean they don't want him to do the policies that they want him to do, but that's part of the process. And look, this is somewhat related, right? What should happen if the Supreme Court rules against the administration? Big number, it should follow the court's ruling. So again, that's still majority that thinks in terms of those checks and balances.
Big respect for the branches and separation of powers. All right, Anthony Salvanto, thank you as always.
Thanks.
CBS News will have special coverage all day Tuesday of the first 100 days of the president's second term. Organizers say several days of Pride events at the Kennedy Center have been canceled or relocated as the institution pivots under President Trump's leadership. The events were part of the World Pride Festival, which is held every 2 years in Washington to celebrate LGBTQ rights. Kennedy Center events were billed as the Tapestry of Pride and were scheduled to run through the last 4 days of the festival. However, multiple artists and producers involved say events have been quietly canceled or moved to other venues. Following the cancellations, Washington's Capital Pride Alliance disassociated itself from the Kennedy Center. Its deputy director told the Associated Press, quote, "We are finding another path to celebration, but the fact that we have to maneuver in this way is disappointing." Associated Press reporter Ashraf Khalil has been following the story, and he joins us now. Ashraf, thanks for being here. What are some of the events that were canceled, and what are artists and organizers telling you?
Well, some of when the cancellations happened, some of the plans were still coming together. So I spoke with one organizer who sort of knew that she was going to have a day, but was figuring out what she was going to do to fill that day. One thing that was definitely canceled was a performance by the International Pride Orchestra, which was going to perform on June 5th. They were deep into contract negotiations. They knew what theater they were going to be playing at the Kennedy Center, and all of that stopped starting February 7th, which is when President Trump put out on Truth Social a statement about the Kennedy Center and about how he planned to make large changes at the Kennedy Center, specifically mentioning drag shows as something that would no longer be allowed. So the International Pride Orchestra, they definitely had all communication stop, and then several days later, February 12th, informed that the contract would not be offered, that the Kennedy Center would not be working with them. So that's a definite cancellation from the part of the Kennedy Center. The Capitol Pride Alliance, in the wake of some of these cancellations, then sort of pulled out completely. But this started with cancellations from the Kennedy Center end.